Hey, I hope you're doing well. Thanks for tuning in this week. Unfortunately, Gracie's busy working this week, so he just got me. This week we're looking at John chapter, supposed to be 15 and 16, but we're really just going to do chapter 15 verses 1 through 17. So right off the bat, we've got some homework for you. If you're looking for something to do in your devotional this week, or you just have some extra time, I know you do. Then read through the rest of this all the way through the end of chapter 16. There's some really good stuff and there's some really hard stuff. So I think it should really challenge you the rest of the week. Maybe read through this in the morning or at night before you go to bed and just do a couple verses and give it some thought. So John chapter 15, we're going to put some questions up. I know last week we had the wrong questions up. So this week we'll have the right ones. The first one requires you to get out paper and it requires you to do a little drawing. It doesn't have to be good. I'll put a little picture up right now. I'll be talking over it. It's a picture of what an actual vine and vine branch looks like. In this passage, Jesus is going to be talking about grapes and vines, and we don't really grow those here in Alabama. Well, actually people do, but we don't. I don't. And there's basically, you'll see in the picture, this old, really long vine with then these little branches coming off of it, which are plucked off and don't last that long, but the main vine can last like years, can be like 30, 40 years old, and still have grapes coming off of it. And so he's going to talk about that a whole lot in this passage. So for the first question, you're going to need to draw out your own version of that and then label it with what's in the picture, like something you do in little kids Sunday school. So go ahead and do that, and then think through the next couple of questions, read the passage, all that normal stuff, and we'll get back to you after that. All right, so assuming you read through everything, there's no Gracie this week, but just me. Let's talk about it. So what did you label as the vine? I mean, hopefully we got that right from the passage. I think I just wanted us to do that, to think through, the fact that in chapter 15 here, Jesus, this is the last of the I am statements, and he labels himself as that main vine, right? The thing that from the roots and everything, all of the nutrients and water goes to the grapes through that vine. And yet the Father is the vine dresser, the man who works the vineyard, the farmer who comes through and is going to lop people off and pick off, broken shoots. I don't know if you've done any farming, or not farming, any gardening, or your parents have done any gardening during quarantine. But if you've ever gardened really anything, you'll know that when there's a branch that's not doing well, or a flower that's not budding, you got to remove the dead bits so that the good ones will grow. I have this little aquarium back here, and whenever leaves and stuff, I need to do some trimming right now, aren't doing well, you got to cut off the bad ones so that the good ones will keep growing. And so that's really what's at play here in this passage. So hopefully you got all the labeling right. And then we are, the branches, the fruit, and we need to bear those little branches, or little stems that bear fruit. You've seen the branch on a grapevine. If you ever get the whole grapes, that's the little branch. There's really this picture that if we are dwelling in Jesus, if we're abiding in him, we'll be bearing fruit. What do you think that fruit looks like? That fruit he kind of leaves it really not very specific here. We're going to dive into that in some of the other questions. But first, let's dig into that second question. I wonder what you wrote down. What does it mean to abide in Christ? To abide in Christ. When I was in middle school, we had a camp one year, and I think the theme was abide. And I was like, what does that mean? It really means just to dwell in him. Right now, all of us are probably a lot more than normal abiding in our homes. We're dwelling in them, we're living in them. But really, abide kind of has this sense that's a little bit bigger than just to stay somewhere. It means to flourish in it, right? To not just be there, but to dwell and to flourish and to be happy and to rest in him. To abide in him, to abide in Jesus, means that we are not just saying we're Christians, we're not just staying in the church, but we're resting, we're dwelling, we're flourishing in him. And that's really a picture that means that we have to do more than just, watch a YouTube video every week or go to church on Sundays. To abide in Christ demands a whole lot more. It's our whole life, right? You can't just abide partially. That's where you live. It has to be your whole life. Okay, so if you read through the rest of the passage, there's a whole lot of commands about loving. Look at verse 9. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's, and I abide in his love. And then in verse 12, he gives us the main imperative, the main thing we need to do in this passage. He says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Now, when Jesus said this, he loved us by becoming one of us. When we read this, we know when Jesus talks about what he's done to show us his love is dying on the cross. And this next line is sort of, tragic, because this is, again, where they're still in the upper room talking. Jesus says, "Greater love has no love than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." In the story, he hasn't yet done this, but we know, of course, that he's going to lay down his life for us. And there's this picture of, what is it? We have the question 3, how can we, and you specifically, me specifically, love one another? How can we lay down our lives for our friends? Right now, I've been talking with a lot of folks, and there's a ton of different issues, or a ton of different views on, coronavirus, on when we should reopen, on what's worse, the staying at home, the economy, or the actual virus, all kinds of disputes. And there's a really simple command here. Love one another. Lay down your life for your friends. The Bible is really big on this. It's not about being right. It's about loving one another. Jesus came and he knew exactly that he was perfectly right and righteous, and we were perfectly not. We were all sinners. And yet, that wasn't the main point. His point was, I'm going to love you. And for us to love one another means that regardless of our opinions, regardless of maybe even something less important, just who we like at school, friends, maybe siblings that you're getting annoyed with right now, regardless of how you feel about them, to love them is to care for them like Jesus did. And that's really, really hard. That's only going to happen if we are abiding in Jesus. It's not hard, it's impossible. It's only going to happen if we are abiding in him. Otherwise, I don't know how, we're going to love the people who we really are frustrated with, or maybe we really disagree with. When we're really angry, I don't know how we're going to love them without abiding, without resting, without dwelling in Jesus. So then we've got the last thing. There's a ton of stuff here, way more than we have time to talk about today. But there's this picture of the Father's the vine dresser. He's coming in and he's pruning some branches. The other ones he's grafting in. It talks about that in Romans. He's helping us all to grow, to flourish in this picture of a grapevine, which is often compared in the Old Testament to Israel itself. And Paul's going to use the same picture in Romans to compare us, Gentiles, being grafted in to this and, woven into this vine that was Israel, and now we get to be a part of it. And there's this last question of, what does this whole thing tell us about the character of God? That's kind of a not very normal Bible study question, but I think it really should be. There's a lot of passages that are really hard for us to get like a clear thing for us to do out of, a clear application. Especially, it's really easy right here. It says, love one another. Great, that's easy. We can talk about that. Sometimes in the Old Testament especially, it's really hard for us to figure out, what do we need to do with this? Why do we need to read this today? And one of these great questions that I always love to ask is, how does this passage teach us about God's character? What does this teach us about who God is? When we read the Bible, we should be looking for things that affect us. We should really be looking for not things about us, but things about God, right? So in this passage, what do you think it's teaching you about who God is? I'm not looking for a right answer here. There's probably some wrong ones, but there's not one answer I'm looking for. But what does it teach you about God's character. To me, the thing that really stands out in this passage is at the end, verse 16. This might be a little typical, but it's something we believe at Cross Creek. Verse 16, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. When he's saying that, he's got this real clear message at the beginning, verse 16. It's not about, you didn't choose me, I chose you. It's not about my decision to follow Jesus that saved me. It's Jesus' decision to love me that saved me. To me, when I hear that, when I look at this picture of a vine with certain branches being cut off and others being grafted and being taken care of and abiding in the Father, I see God's character as loving and also as a Father that is more powerful than me. And that's really reassuring. When I see this passage, I think about God's character as one that is loving and one that is choosing. God has chosen me, he's chosen each of you and offered you an extension. Will you grow in him? Will you abide in him? If you do, there's going to be fruit. If you're not abiding in him, there's not going to be fruit. Is there a lack of spiritual fruit in your life? Are you growing closer to Christ day by day? Great, if so. If not, there's a serious problem. There's a serious problem, right? It talks about in this passage how there's branches that are thrown away, they're cast into the fire. And each of us has to ask ourselves, has to look around at some point, are we abiding in the Father? If we're not, there's not going to be fruit, and we're going to be thrown off. We're going to be cast into that fire, and it's terrifying. When we see this passage, we know about the character of God. At least to me, it stands out that God doesn't actually save everyone. There are some branches that grow and bear fruit. There are others that don't. And so for me, this is really reassuring, because if we really want to grow, if we're really abiding in him, then we will grow. What does a branch have to do to grow? Nothing. Just stay on the tree. What do you need to do in Christ? Well, not nothing, but the power, the actual growth comes from God. Maybe different ministers water, maybe you help till the soil, but God provides the growth. And so this week, hopefully I'm encouraging you to, hopefully you will, read through the rest of the chapter, read through chapter 16. There's a little bit at the end of chapter 16 where they talk about, why are you using all this figurative language? Jesus, can you just tell us what you're trying to say? So I encourage you to read through that this week, but really just abide in the Father's love, abide in his word, and grow in love as we try to love one another and those that maybe frustrate us, those that maybe we just naturally love. There's a whole lot here for you. My prayer is that you would abide in the Father, and that I would as well. Hope you have a great week, and I'm sure we'll try and get Gracie on next week, and check out our videos on Wednesday. We had Harrison last week, as we're continuing through Samuel on Wednesdays. All right, see you next week.